EM Weekly is starting right now.
And I like to remind them, we went to the moon and back without ICS. So you can say it's better than sliced bread, but it's not the only way to manage complex operations.
Hi, and welcome to EM Weekly. This is your host, Todd DeVoe. And as of this recording this morning, we have over 3,330 downloads. I'm really excited about that. It's showing that our community is growing, and I'm excited about this. And this is definitely with your help. So we've had a lot of interaction on www.emweekly.com, and we've also had on our Facebook and on Twitter and on LinkedIn. All over the place, we have interaction going on with this podcast. I'm proud that we're interviewing former FEMA administrator under the Obama administration, Craig Fugate. We talked a little bit about ICS, ESFs, disaster emergency support functions, that is, disaster response in general, and also a lot about volunteer organizations in disaster recovery and Team Rubicon specifically. So I'm excited about having this interview done, and well, let's get into it. So, sir, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's my pleasure.
So how did you get involved in emergency management from the beginning? Like, what brought you to this business?
I answered my phone. I was lieutenant, just got promoted lieutenant in Alachua County Fire Rescue, and that's north central Florida. It's our county seat is Gainesville, Florida, home of the University of Florida. And I just made lieutenant, and I got offered three things to work on a management project. They wanted all the lieutenants to come into town and do a couple of weeks downtown, pick up some management experience. I was given three projects, and I picked updating the county's disaster plan, and that was in February of 1987. And that turned into a much longer reassignment and ultimately became my profession.
So what drew you after you started doing that, secondary or collateral duty, as we call it? What drew you to stay in the EM world?
Well, I've just found it fascinating, this idea of stepping back and looking at very hard to solve problems and looking at different ways to approach them. And, when I first got started in this, we were still planning for population relocation in the event of a nuclear attack. Mm-hmm. Emergency management was still pretty much embryonic, and there were a lot of things that were changing in the profession, most notably a growing awareness at the local and state level of the need to have programs and personnel in place to respond to disasters. And so it was a good time to get started in the program, and it was just something that really fascinated me, and I found that I enjoyed working in it.
So during your work in Florida, obviously the hurricanes were your big worry, correct? And so how many hurricanes did you respond to, one, and then two, how did you start getting people to really take preparedness for that event seriously?
I've never really kept track of hurricanes. Most notably was the 4 landfalling hurricanes in 2004. We kept track of those, obviously. Mm-hmm. But, hurricanes, people always think of Florida as a hurricane-prone state, which we are. They also forget we have a lot of other hazards, including a drought cycle that produces some of the worst wildfires on the East Coast, tornado outbreaks, especially during strong El Niños. February of 1998, we had a tornado outbreak in Central Florida, killed 42 people. And you don't usually think of Florida as having those kind of tornado impacts. In addition to that, most of our tornadoes, our most deadly tornadoes, are between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m.
Wow.
So our tornadoes occur at night. They're usually embedded in rain, hard to see. The joke in Florida is we don't chase tornadoes, we run from them. And so we had a variety of hazards, and then we also had a fair amount of technological. There was a train derailment out in Youngstown, Florida, that was carrying chlorine that killed numerous people and was a huge derailment out there. So Florida's history has been primarily, hurricanes, but we have a lot of other hazards. And so it was like, how do you get ready for things, some which you can see coming like a hurricane? And our big issue there is getting people to evacuate. Right. To other events that are not the traditional message that you get for, well, it's like tornado risk. Most of Florida didn't have outdoor siren systems. most tornadoes occurred when people were in bed or asleep. So how do you warn people? And so one of the things we did was help build out the NOAA Weather Radio Network, trying to get more people to do that. We had a much greater success in getting schools to install those. We used state dollars and grant dollars to purchase NOAA the radios for all the public schools. It was always a challenge getting people to take this kind of this mindset that I've lived here all my life. It's never been that bad to when it's that bad, what are you going to do? Are you ready? And particularly, do you know what evacuation zone you're in?
Right. Yeah, there always seems to be that problem with a person who's been there forever. So back with the NOAA aspect, were you part of the beginning of the Storm Ready program?
Yeah, we had some of the first weather ready communities. In fact, we made that a requirement for all of our counties to become storm ready. This was actually part of an assessment that we did on warning. And I said, well, if you become storm ready, I will say that will check the box for all the other things we were doing under the warning assessment of our annual reviews of their plans, particularly for their grant dollars. So that was one of the things that we partnered with our Weather Service offices to try to promote. And initially, a lot of people thought we couldn't do it, but ultimately we got most of the counties to get storm ready. In fact, some of them got it. Others started thinking, well, if they can get it, I can get it.
Right.
But it's just really going back and making sure that you've documented and have demonstrated that you can get warnings from the Weather Service, multiple paths, and that you can get warnings out to the public, and that you have an effective system. So we utilize things like Storm Ready in its early days to kind of push emergency managers at the county and city level to really make sure they have that capability. And by having that assessment, it went a long ways to it got to be a kind of a status symbol of who got their sign and their picture out first in an area when they started doing the Storm Ready program.
That's great. We kind of did that with the Tsunami Ready in Orange County, California. We were the first county to be tsunami ready entirely. So that was kind of like a big bragging point for a lot of us on the coastal communities here. So yeah, I see that the same type of thing goes down. So to kind of switch gears here, a few years ago, I was at a conference, and I happened to sit at your table for lunch, and we're kind of having a roundtable conversation, and we started talking about what the role of the emergency manager is in general. And I remember you stated that the emergency manager is kind of like a football coach, getting everybody ready for game day, and then during the game day, he's kind of on the sidelines. Where did you kind of come up with that concept? Because I use that all the time now. I teach at a Coastline Community College, and I tell my students that as well, and I credit it to you, of course. So that concept, is that something that, I mean, obviously that's what it is, but I mean, how do you teach that to people, and how do you get the people to understand that that's what our role is? Well,
I think it starts with, how do you build a team? I love Tommy Lee Jones. He's a great actor, but that movie Volcano, where he is the one man emergency operation show, goes in the field and solves all the problems, tends to create the idea that emergency managers are the superheroes. And we're not. We have to bring a lot of different agencies that on a day-to-day basis normally don't work together, and get them to give up some of their autonomy and work as a collective organization to solve problems. And that's not easy to do, particularly when you deal with a lot of very strong-willed agency heads that are used to solving problems on their own. And as I tell people, I said, if you really want to break down what emergency management does, is we exist because government on a day-to-day basis with the normal organization and the org chart can't solve the problems fast enough or manage the event. Because if you can manage the event with the day-to-day organizations, you don't really need emergency management. And I tell people, I said, look, when somebody's house catches on fire and you dial 911 and the fire department responds and puts the fire out, arson investigators come in and say it was an accidental fire. For that family, it's a disaster. But for the community, it's an emergency, and the day-to-day organizational structures work. When you have a wildfire racing into an area and you're now having to evacuate block after block, and the fire department no longer has the resources, you're having to get the school to open up shelters, you have to bring the Red Cross to do shelter managers, you're having to look at a lot of things simultaneously that no one agency is going to have all the answers or all the capabilities. You need to bring them into a location, working together, sitting across from each other, and hopefully not the first night when they're evacuating, they've done this, that they have the confidence, you built the team. And the better you are, the less work you do, because they're going to be solving problems faster. But I had a Secretary of Transportation who said it best about the State Emergency Operations Center. He says, when you walk in here, you check your ego and your logo at the door, and you're now part of the State Emergency Response Team.
Right.
And so I really saw my role as, A, creating that environment that they felt confident to operate in, but 2, building the trust between agencies that they could see they could get faster and better by giving up some of their autonomy and maybe letting other agencies do things that they're better at versus you trying to solve all your problems. And probably one of the classic examples was our state veterinarian. We were doing some planning and exercising on animal disease outbreaks, and you only have so many, veterinarians as part of that. And we found that they had adopted the incident command system, which was good, but they had veterinarians doing logistics. And I'm like, doctors, let me ask you a question. How many vets do we have? Well, not enough. I said, well, we got all these firefighters and people from forestry and a whole lot of other places that are used to working in the incident command system. They can do your planning, they can do your logistics, but we really need you guys to focus on as the subject matter experts of dealing with this disease, the epidemiology, and what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. But a lot of this other work that is now taking away from that, we can have other agencies do it. And the state veterinarian time was like, we never really thought of it that way. We thought we had to do everything ourselves. And I'm like, no, that's the whole idea of the State Emergency Response Team. The lead agency may change based upon the event and the authorities, but the team as a whole, basically, we just rotate the wheel to whoever needs support. And then as a collection of agencies, we're just not all showing up going to the lead agencies. What do you need? Right. We're there working. We've trained together. We know each other, and we're able to actually get better and faster. But that won't happen if you're not out there practicing. The term we play like we practice as a sports analogy is true in emergency management. If that team is not exercising, if they're not being stressed, if they're not putting the situations to basically force them to recognize that the day-to-day business model just won't work anymore and they got to change up, then when the actual event occurs, it's not going to go well. But the better you do that, and the more that team is now no longer a collection of agencies showing up, but a team made up of agencies, your job really in many cases is to maybe help set the goals and objectives for the team. But most of the work those agencies are going to be doing, but they're going to be doing it together and getting greater efficiency, greater speed, and maximizing your available resources when you have hardly anything and you got more need than you got resources.
So that really truly becomes like the true unified command. That then I remember we had a pretty large fire out here, and the fire chief comes out and says, well, we're establishing unified command, and I'm the incident commander. And I kind of laughed to myself. I said, I'm not really sure that's how that works, Chief, but okay, we'll go with it. So, I mean, I know through the lessons learned and everything that we're trying to get better at this, but do you think that we're doing a better job now than we did in the past with the unified command, or do we still have a long way to go?
Well, we have a lot of people saying they're a unified command, but that's not what it really, I see them doing. An example would be that fire chief. If that fire is that bad, they got their hands full. Why do they want to do traffic control and route people? All they really should have to say is, as part of unified command, this is the area we're going to try to stop the fire. These are the areas we need to evacuate. Turn to the law enforcement and says, you got that? And in the unified command, they got it. And now they're running that piece of that response. Mm-hmm. And the fire chief can now focus on fighting the fire. But that law enforcement agency is going to have to make decisions that they're not going to be able to go back to that fire chief every time, nor should they if it's not germane to the fire chiefs fighting the fire. And so really it's about dividing that labor with the agencies that have the core competencies and legal authority to act, working as one team. That unified command agrees this is what we're going to do. But unlike traditional, where there's a single incident commander, those individuals are empowered within that unified command to take action to carry out their part of the problem without necessarily having to go back all the time to one person. Only if there are issues that come up that unified command needs to resolve, because there are going to be prioritizations or issues that the individual agencies aren't going to be able to manage. But a unified command is really about not one person saying, okay, we're unified and everybody's working for me. Right. It's about taking the agencies that in many cases have either overlapping or different authorities and bringing them together as a team to solve the problem faster than they would normally working independent of each other or working from different command posts on different sides of the event.
Right.
I mean, I'm just happy when they co-locate. I think that's a big accomplishment.
Yeah, we have some issues over here on the West Coast, obviously, where we have, a county fire going into a state fire area going into national forestry areas. So there was a lot of crossover for sure. And I think that was like one of those issues that was associated with that. The last few years, we've been really pushing out the concept and the practice of the incident management teams and bringing in disciplines from all over the place. What do you think of that concept and the new real push for the IMTs to be out there?
I think it's one of the best force multipliers we have, particularly a lot of incident management teams are hazard specific. These originally came out of the forestry teams to augment during serious wildfires and be able to deploy management teams to go in and manage that. But let's talk about EOCs. Very few jurisdictions, including a lot of states, and that I've put Florida in that category when I was state director, has all the people and resources to run 24-hour operations for days in a row. And at the local level, even our large jurisdictions were hard pressed to staff all the positions they needed when they were running 24-hour operations. And our rural communities, our rural counties, just wasn't even possible. They usually had maybe one or two people, and everybody else was collateral duties or volunteers. And they always had a shortfall. So we had began in Florida building EOC-specific incident management teams made up of the non-impacted counties and city emergency managers. And that proved very successful in the 04 hurricanes. It proved very successful as we began using the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC, supporting Mississippi. And we sent teams over to some of the hardest hit Gulf Coast counties. And, showing up with a 9-person team that was self-contained, had communications, and could walk in and either provide immediate backup or in some cases relief to people that had been working nonstop as Katrina had, from the evacuation through landfall, is a tremendous force multiplier. The other part of that is it's some of the best training people will ever get, being able to deploy to somebody else's disaster and learn from that and bring that home. So I always tell, elected officials and city mayors and county managers that, don't think of this as you're losing people to go help somebody else. That they're going to come back with more experience and knowledge that will benefit your community far in excess of any training they'll ever get. So I'm a big proponent. If people ask, for your assistance, you should always try to go. And by putting teams together ahead of time, it helps mutually support each other. But in county operations and city EOC operations, except for the largest jurisdictions, it becomes a tremendous pool of personnel that can come in and augment or relieve local or state staff that in some cases are actually impacted by the disasters themselves and hadn't even had a chance to go home and check on their family or their homes.
Right. Yeah, that is kind of... I really like the idea that we're using that over here in some form on the West Coast now, and I do think I agree with you that it's important for being able to, for people to learn too. To be able to get out to some of those larger events when you don't have them every day. Here on the West Coast specifically, getting to some of the larger events that are on the East Coast. I think sometimes that helps out. We're gonna take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the concept of the emergency support functions.
There is at least one person that's been shot. Somebody is still shooting inside.
453, I have a party shot here. I need rescue high.
Are you ready for the unthinkable? Call our friends at High Speed TACMed. They provide custom emergency planning and training that saves lives. With years of experience in law enforcement, search and rescue, responding to and managing large-scale incidents, HSTM will evaluate and prepare written plans, training sessions, drills, and debriefs, leaving you with the necessary tools and experience that can save lives. Call HSTM today to discuss your specific needs, and the staff at High Speed TACMed will help ensure that you're ready and are in complete compliance. Call High Speed TACMed today at 805-419-0024. Again, that's 805-419-0024. The friendly staff at HSTM is standing by.
Bringing out bodies now. Get someone to the back as soon as you can. Rescue personnel. I got at least 3 to 7 hits.
Emergencies happen. Whether they're related to medical emergencies, threats of physical violence, weather-related, or other. One of the most difficult things during an emergency is to find help and quickly and efficiently communicate with all parties. regardless of whether you're an administrator, law enforcement, or the end user. With Titan HST, we help to store time by creating high-tech, yet simple-to-use mobile-based applications that connect you with the people who can help you. At Titan HST, we believe in the power of people.
Hi, this is Todd DeVoe from EM Weekly. If your company is in the emergency management and response space, EM Weekly is a place for you to advertise. Each week, we bring in experts in emergency management, response, and leadership from around the world, and they're here to share their best practices. Our listeners are eager to learn about new products and ideas, so this is the space for you. For more information, please contact Brian at brian@emweekly.com. Welcome back from the break. So before we went to the break, I was mentioning that we're going to talk about the emergency support functions and what exactly that is and how that comes and some of the controversy, and I'm using that term lately, between how that works in the EOC and that some jurisdictions and some states aren't really embracing the ESF. So, sir, the emergency support functions, why isn't that being embraced by more states?
Well, some are, they don't see how it fits in the incident command system, and they're what I call the ICS purist, and so they don't think it has a place. But all of the emergency support function is grouping agencies over common functions. And it is not unusual to find that different agencies all have overlapping responsibilities. So let's take on the federal government side. Who has the greatest number of hospitals in the federal government?
VA.
Yeah. So if you're talking health and medical, but you're basically going only through health and human services, you just left almost all of the hospital capacity that you have to augment civilian and local responses in a pandemic or any other type of mass casualty event. Mm-hmm. So the idea was you take all of the agencies that have a role in public health and public health emergencies, including veterinarians, and you put them all together in one functional area with a lead agency aversus under the ICS system, if you don't use ESFs, you're having to go to every one of them independently. Right. So if your agencies, if your legislature has done a rational job of assigning responsibilities and you don't have duplicate or overlapping or multiple agencies performing similar functions, that may work. But I'm from Florida, where basically every cabinet agency and just about every department had their own law enforcement.
Right.
So when we needed to coordinate law enforcement and we were getting, from the sheriffs and the police chiefs these requests, it was like, well, who gets it? Highway Patrol, Fish and Wildlife, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Motor Compliance Carrier, even the lottery had criminal investigators. So we just said, well, let's just put them all in one group. Florida Department of Law Enforcement became the lead agency. We added the Florida Sheriff's Association, Florida Police Chiefs, and National Guard was their backup. So if any law enforcement related mission came in, we didn't have to go run down an agency. They were all in one room working as one team, determining what the best allocation of resources. We did the same thing for search and rescue, and that's where Fish and Wildlife and our structural firefighters actually blended in, because the wildlife folks had boats and helicopters and could get into areas that most anybody else couldn't get on the rural area, but also on barrier islands during hurricane impacts. Right. And the urban search and rescue teams would actually partner up with them. And it was not uncommon for us to have a Fish and Wildlife boat operator taking urban search and rescue teams out to barrier islands and post-hurricane environments doing search and rescue operations. So the idea of the ESS was, hey, if you only had one agency doing something, maybe. But if you looked at what we do in disasters and you started grouping your agencies around those functions versus dealing with them as a collection of agencies, it gave you more efficiency. It also meant that if a public health issue came up, we just gave it the health and medical. It could be anything from, an assisted living facility needs evacuating to they're running out of diesel fuel for a hospital. It was like anything that said medical, they went there, and then they knew who else among those functions could support them. So if they needed diesel, they didn't go out and order diesel. They tasked that to the function. In our case, that was Resource ESF 7, who had state contracts for all of our fuel suppliers that could then get fuel routed to that hospital. But it was more of an organization, and kind of was interesting to me as, the span of control is it was really breaking down what we did, not who we are, and then grouping all of the different agencies that had capability around the things that we are likely required to do in a disaster versus trying to individually task and sort and triage between agencies who's best fit for the problem.
Yeah, it seems to be like some of the again, controversy for lack of a better term, comes in the concept of an ICS. And then when we move that into the Emergency Operations Center, sometimes there's a loss in the translation of who does what. And I've worked with some people in the past who tried to do tactics from the EOC, and I had to, kind of say, no, that's not, during a drill, thank God, that, no, this is not how we do it. This is more of a policy issues up here. And it seems like an ESF would really kind of fix those communication issues. Do you believe that, or am I off base on that?
It worked for us. Florida adopted emergency support functions right after Hurricane Andrew. They were in the original FEMA response plan, and it was still a draft and being piloted about the time Andrew happened. And in Florida, we adopted them. They made sense, and it gave us a way to take a lot of agencies who had overlapping or duplicate efforts and put them into the same grouping with lead and support and clearly define those roles and responsibilities. The thing about the instant command system, and I've been in the fire service, I've been using this since, the 80s when this was really starting to move out across the country. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we were still, debating whether it was going to be fire ground command or instant command. And my observation is whenever you try to make an event fit the system you're using, you got a problem. I'm much more agnostic about ICS and much more flexible in how it can adapt to solve problems. But I've seen people so rigid that they will literally hold fast to the ICS doctrine, even though it is obviously not working with a lot of different agencies. And I like to remind them, we went to the moon and back without ICS. So you can say it's better than sliced bread, but it's not the only way to manage complex operations.
So yeah, I mean, that's so true. I was working with a small agency that realistically they're trying to operate from an EOC, and they didn't have enough manpower or staffing in the EOC because they're so small that they had to have people out in the field. And I kind of suggested to go to, a management team, type of structure, more like a field ICS type thing. And they were losing their mind because they just couldn't get their head around the fact that they didn't have an emergency operations center running. They were just too small. I mean, so there is that needs to be the flexibility. What term that I learned when I was serving as a corpsman of the Marine Corps is Semper Gumby, and that's why I tried to. Don't be so rigid.
And the thing about there's always this debate about are they EOCs or are they multi-agency coordination centers, and I try to differentiate us. And the EOC is where the elected authority and who is authorized to execute that authority in an emergency operates and sets up the policies and priorities. And I try to remind people, I said, look, doesn't matter how high up you're in the organization. Almost all of the emergency authorities that are granted by state legislation, local legislation, or federal law are vested in the elected leadership, not the appointed leadership. And it's important that people understand that, part of the role of that EOC is where that elected leadership exercises their authorities. I know a lot of people in the business would just assume they wouldn't exercise anything, declare the emergency and get out of the way.
Right.
But that's not what they are supposed to do. That is, there's a reason the law entrusts them with those authorities and how they delegate and execute that. But that is where they are going to operate from. They will actually establish policy. It goes much further than just coordinating across multiple agencies and resources, feeding into a single or maybe multiple incident command post. It's really how the community sets the policies, makes the priorities, decisions that only the elected leadership can really make, particularly declaring the emergency, some of the fiscal issues, requesting assistance, because ultimately they are the legal authorities and they are accountable to the citizens for that response. Right. And that EOC is where part of that responsibility is executed.
Yeah, I mean, I know in California, I think it's 7 days that we have before we can do things without bringing it to the city council, and we try to do it before, in a good way. We try to get it to them prior to make sure that they're on board with what we're doing, and we try to make sure that we have a policy room working and functioning just like we would in any other room in the EOC, so that they're up to date and kept up to date, and so they're making wise decisions. And that's kind of how I feel my role as an emergency manager is, just to make sure that our elected officials do have the right up to information to make the best decisions and to counsel them in that way. So I do agree with that 100%. So let's change speed here a little bit. So what are you doing now that you're no longer over in Washington?
I'm still an emergency manager. Everybody assumed that I was retired. I'm like, well, I'm a little bit too young to retire. I tell people now what I do is I work on projects for people I want to work with and projects that interest me. I have engagements with different companies. I set up my little LLC mainly as a contracting vehicle for other companies. But I work as an advocate for different people. And a lot of these were issues I was talking about before I ever, left FEMA and left government service. And so there's people out there that want me to engage to help them with the messaging and how to communicate and make sure people understand the importance. So I'm working with, folks like the National Association of Broadcasters.
Cool.
I'm a senior advisor to a couple of groups where they bring me in to meet with their folks. And, it's not much different than what I was doing before I left. It just, I tell people, instead of having one boss and one paycheck, I got multiple bosses, some of which actually pay. Part of this was I wanted to come home. I wanted to work on things that interest me. And I wanted to take a step back. I spent so much time looking at how you respond better and focusing on that I wanted to take a step back and go, why are we having to respond so hard to such big events? And start asking questions that I now have the luxury and time to be able to ask, such as, why are we building in areas that are high risk and then are somewhat surprised when disasters happen and it overwhelms the system?
Right.
I keep telling people, every time you tell me that it was an act of God, I say, quit blaming God. He didn't tell you to build there that way.
Right.
And if you look at climate change, you look at disruptive weather events that are leading our disasters, whether it's the boom bust cycle of drought, wildfires, and the instant flooding, mudslides. Most recently, we had the fatalities in Arizona the other day from burn scar with flash flooding and debris flow that killed children. But building in areas along coastal communities or into the interface area, and building in the interface area with homes that have combustible materials making up the primary surface of the structure. Right. And people are surprised when they burn up in a wildfire. It's not as if we don't know how to build, but for some reason, we seem to have collective amnesia at the local level when somebody comes in and wants to build or develop that, I lived here all my life. It's never that bad. That's just going to make those homes unaffordable. That's just more bureaucratic red tape. Problem is we're writing so many checks at the federal level to pay for those decisions that we have actually priced risk so low that a lot of the local governments don't even take steps to minimize in the future, because if it's ever that bad, somebody else will pay.
Yeah.
And I point out people like Governor Brown has taken steps within the state on the wildfire situation, looking at mitigation and how to fund that with state dollars, and looking at things that has historically been stuff people didn't want to touch. It's almost like the third rail to say we shouldn't build a certain way in a certain place. He's been willing to take that stand, going, we cannot sustain our wildfire risk if we don't change how we're building and where we're building. There's just not enough firefighters or enough money to keep putting out all the fires. We see similar things here on the East Coast, where we continue to get development in coastal areas. Part of that subsidized through the National Flood Insurance Program, which currently is $25 billion in debt.
Right.
And so I'm asking questions. We're up for reauthorization of the flood insurance bill this year, and it's not going to be easy. We have a lot of built homes in areas that are extremely vulnerable that, quite honestly, if we're not providing a subsidized product to those folks, they get priced out of their homes. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that's a good idea. But I'm also pretty sure we should not be subsidizing new construction. And so I'd like them to just take and do one thing, and that is when they pass the reauthorization, put a clause in there that says the National Flood Insurance Program cannot sell insurance to new construction. Let the private sector insure it. And if the private sector won't insure it, then why should the taxpayer?
Exactly. I lived on Long Island for a bit when I was a kid, and we had a road. It's called Dune Road. It's over in the Hamptons. That would get every year we get hurricane blow over from that, and we'd lose a home or two over there, and the road would get covered. And it got to the point to where they just said, "Yep, we're going to let you keep the houses there. We're not going to let you rebuild, and or if you do, you're going to be on your own on that." And let the people let the private insurance companies do that, because you're right. We're just it's amazing how much money that we are spending on those homes, and people still build there. I remember there's a story about a town in Illinois that they actually moved the entire town up on top of a hilltop back in I guess it was in the 60s. And, that's the mitigation right there. Yep, we're going to have a flood. We know what's going to happen. And they turn that floodplain into parks. So, we know this is happening, and making sure that we're doing things right. Hey, real quick, what do you think of the new wave of disaster response or disaster volunteer groups such as like Team Rubicon?
This is something that I encourage. I continue to see groups that emerge out of failure, and that Team Rubicon does several things. It brings in veterans, and there's been a lot written about post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I think it's to the point where everybody thinks a veteran automatically must have post-traumatic stress syndrome. But in a lot of the research, what they found is when veterans return from overseas, one of the things that helped them integrate in society and adjust is to give them purpose. And having gone from a combat tour of duty to coming back stateside and working a job, many of them missed that sense of being able to give themselves to support others. And so Team Rubicon actually does several things. One, it harnesses a lot of creative talents and energies, but it also becomes a very healthy outlet for veterans coming back to be able to continue what, in many cases, if you asked them, of all the things you could do, when you get back, what do you want to do? And outside of staying in the military, it was helping people in their time of need. Yeah. So you'll have groups emerge. Some of them, like Team Rubicon, will become larger, more organized. Others will be ad hoc at the time of an event. But I try to caution people who say that, we got to be careful with those folks because they're not trained, or, they may do more harm, or, we look at the public as a liability. I'm going, if you can be picky, it's not that bad. I'm at the point where I'm telling people that our fastest response is neighbors helping neighbors. Right. And we have got to quit looking at the public as a liability and really see them as a resource, because the bigger the disaster, the more likely they will be the first responders. They're going to do more good. And rather than taking the approach of, well, they're not trained, they're going to do too much harm, they need to wait for the professionals, I'm like, well, that actually is not working out very well in the shootings, because we now have people so afraid to try to stop bleeding that they're not sure what to do, that their response is not to do anything, and we're seeing people bleed to death. And so it's really about re-engaging the public. Right. And so you're going to have volunteer groups that emerge. You're going to have volunteer groups that come out of areas where they saw a need, they were able to meet it. Some of them will go away. Others, like Team Rubicon, will grow. Right. But that's the nature of the business. Anytime we have failure in response and a group steps in and is able to meet that need, we create a new capability. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of our community emergency response teams, and also Team Rubicon for that matter. I think those organizations like that do so much good, and you're absolutely right. I think I read a statistic one time. I don't remember where I got it from, so I don't want to quote it, but it was something around 90% of all rescues, and they're talking about even day-to-day rescues, are done by the layperson until the professional rescuers can get there. So if going with that statistic, if you think about large events, kind of like a Katrina or Sandy for that matter, it's going to be those public service organizations that are organized like Team Rubicon that's going to be able to come in and have a greater impact on our communities than bringing all the rescuers in, especially in the recovery aspect of it. I tell my students that recovery, I think, is one of the hardest things to do, because after all the lights and sirens go away and the media goes away, recovery still has
to happen. And that's why I think recovery plans are something that we really need to take a look at.
I saw where John Bell Edwards, we were working with him in the floods this past year. They had so many homes flooded, and the first thing you got to do in a flooded home is get them mucked out, get the sheetrock and everything else out that got wet to control the mold. And there just wasn't enough people, and volunteer groups from all across the country, a lot of them church groups, planned trips to go in and help muck out homes. And relatively quickly, we were able to see the results of that and getting homes ready for rebuilding much faster than they would have without them.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just identifying a need and communicating that, and volunteer groups will mobilize, respond. And as we saw in Louisiana, the majority of homes that got mucked out, we had neighbors helping neighbors, or a lot of church groups helping out people that needed help getting their homes. And some of those groups came from all over the country. They just weren't for their local folks helping. They were coming from across the country.
Yep, that's the best part about in my humble opinion about being here in America, is that we have neighbors that love to help each other. And even though we kind of think that we're not that altruistic, I think sometimes that we really are. Sir, one last question before I let you go. If you would recommend a book or a publication to somebody who's new into emergency management or wants to be an emergency manager, what would that be?
The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley.
I agree with you 100%. Great book.
Well, I think what it does is you read the book, you understand why it's so important to exercise and train before disaster, and that you have to plan for not what you expect day to day, but for literally events that are just hard to fathom. And she has many stories in there from 9/11 and how people reacted in the towers when the plane crashed. And she backs it up with a lot of research about plane crashes, police shootings, and how the more we train, the more we develop the muscle memory, the better we are able to deal with the things we expected, but more importantly, the things we never did. There is a lot of documentation, and I've seen this in operation centers where, for too many emergency managers, the inside story for us is your first big disaster is your first big disaster. And people are oftentimes paralyzed. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important to exercise, not to what your comfort level is or what the history of your events, but to really exercise against the things that they may be unlikely, but if they occur, are going to take your system down if you're not prepared for it.
Right.
And part of it is that mental ability to shift from this will never happen to, well, if it does, what do we do first? And if you can get just that far in the discussion and an exercise, that if it did happen, what would be the first priorities? What would be the things you do? And you thought through that. You've already improved your ability to manage large-scale disaster. And that book gives you a lot of insights into why that happens. There's a lot of rigor in her research. But the basic premise is we play like we practice. Mm-hmm. And if we're always practicing the scrimmages around the things we're good at, when the disaster doesn't play by our rules, we flounder. And that book gives excellent examples of how some cases people were seen as almost bizarrely taken with what they needed to be prepared for, yet on 9/11 that saved lives.
Right.
The fact that they had turned something so extraordinary into something so routine, such as evacuating a building in a high-rise from a variety of threats, versus those companies that didn't practice that, didn't do it unannounced, always knew when the fire alarms were going to be sounded, and basically looked at that as a break to go get something or go take a smoke break. The difference in those companies' philosophies in some cases meant who got out of the tower, who didn't.
It's amazing. Yeah, I had the honor of seeing her speak a couple of times, and she's an amazing speaker too. And the book is great. Well, one last question: if anybody wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
They can get me at craigfugate.com. No, it's craig@craigfugate.com. I got to remember that one. And I'm also on Twitter. It's WCraigFugate. So I'm on LinkedIn, got Facebook, got email, got Twitter. So I'm pretty well covered that way.
All right, well, we'll put all those contact information down in the show notes as well. Well, again, sir, thank you so much for taking time out of your day, and I know you're busy to talk to me and to talk to EM Weekly is much appreciated, and I'd love to have you on again.
Sure, we'll pick another topic in another day.